Our guest speaker today actually practices Earth Day every day, but I will back up a little bit and say that in recognition of Earth Day, I really think it's appropriate to celebrate the Appalachian Mountain Range, as it is one of the oldest mountain ranges on the planet. I think there's one down in South Africa somewhere that's a bit older, but who's counting, you know? Um, it's actually so old that it actually doesn't have any fossils in it because it predates all those critters that would have left fossils behind. So that tells you it's pretty old, 1.2 billion years. But this history has allowed the mountains to develop an amazing level of biodiversity. And unfortunately, or it's also located in one of the most densely populated parts of our country. And this balance of protecting this extraordinary place with the desire for us to access it and enjoy it is a key focus of our speaker today, Morgan Somerville, who's the Director of Visitor Use Management for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. Now, Morgan actually thru-hiked 2,000 and some miles of I'd say that because the miles change once in a while due to relocations. He hiked the entire Appalachian Trail in 1977, and he began his career working as a ranger in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. In 1983, he began work with the Appalachian Trail Conference. It's called the Conservancy now, in charge of ATC's work in Georgia, in North Carolina, and Tennessee, helping to build a national park, because the AT is a unit of the national park system, from the ground up. And in 2021, he became the director of ATC's Visitor Use Management Program, leading ATC's work ATY to plan for increasing visitation and associated impacts to maintain or preserve the desired AT experience. And anybody who's either read Bill Bryson's book, A Walk in the Woods, or saw the movie can attest to how interesting that was and how that actually did increase the visitor use significantly. I will say on a personal note, I met Morgan over 30 years ago as a new district ranger on the Cherokee National Forest. And very soon after I got there, Morgan and one of the officers of the local trail maintaining club came to the ranger station to orient this new district ranger on what the AT was all about and hopefully enlist her support for management and care of that resource. What he didn't know was that I had been in love with the AT since I was about 14 with my first backpack trip at Shenandoah National Park. So for him, it was actually a pretty easy sell. Morgan was also the first one I ever saw using those cool hiking poles that I thought, only old folks like I am now use those things, but come to find out they're really cool. And Morgan, my knees have thanked you for the last 30 years for introducing me to hiking poles. So that said, let's welcome, often when we're on mute, we just do this for applause. So let's welcome Morgan. Great to have you with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Candace. Pleasure to be here. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I have had the pleasure of presenting to Rotary clubs several times in Western North Carolina and East Tennessee. I don't think ever in South Carolina before. And while I'm not a Rotary member, my father was a lifelong Rotary Club member. So known about Rotary for a long time. Anyway, I'm going to share my PowerPoint and talk about a little bit about the history of the Appalachian National Scenic Trail, and then some of the current challenges related to Hurricane Helene and to visitor use management.
All right, we're in business.
So some AT history. I'm going to assume that some of you don't know much about the Appalachian Trail, but Benton MacKay is the guy who thought of the Appalachian Trail back in 1921. He wrote an article in an architectural magazine called The Appalachian Trail, a Project in Regional Planning. And it was so well received that people started almost immediately working on the trail. Everybody thought it was a great idea. So in 1922, the first work began, and the first section was completed in 1923 in Interstate Palisades Park along the Hudson River. In 1925, a meeting was organized, which the Appalachian Trail Conference got its name from. That was to oversee the work of getting the Appalachian Trail built and connected from one end to the other. Back then, it's no longer legal, I don't believe, but ATC's executive committee at the time included representatives from the U.S. Forest Service and the National Park Service, as well as all the regions along the trail. The trail was actually initially completed, we say initially because we're still working on it, in 1937, although much of the trail at that time still was on roads. In 1968, the National Trail System Act was passed, which made the AT the first national scenic trail and provided the idea of purchasing a protected greenway for the trail, but that didn't actually come along until 1978 when the act was amended and appropriations began to flow from Congress to purchase lands along the trail. And coinciding with that, the Appalachian Trail Conference, which previously only had about 2 or 3 employees, began to hire regional assistants to help with the relocation planning and acquisition planning and volunteer training required to make a lot of the things work that were going to happen with the new appropriations. And that's when I got hired a little bit after that in 1983. So originally, the AT was supposed to go from Mount Mitchell in western North Carolina to Mount Washington in New Hampshire. After things got going, a guy named Myron Avery got involved, who was from Maine, and he said, "There's no way we're not taking the AT to Mount Katahdin in Maine, which is Maine's highest peak." And after looking around, for some reason, I'm not sure exactly why they didn't choose Mount Mitchell as a southern terminus, but ended up with Mount Oglethorpe in Georgia, which is essentially the last bump of the Blue Ridge in the going south in the Appalachian Mountains. That didn't last too long because there began to be development around Mount Oglethorpe, and in 1958, the southern terminus was changed from Mount Oglethorpe to Springer Mountain. The picture on the left is a picture of the obelisk that was on the summit of Mount Oglethorpe. It fell into disrepair after the AT was moved, and it now has been taken down and restored and is in the center of the town of Jasper, Georgia, which is at the foot of Mount Oglethorpe. And as we noted before, in 1968, the Appalachian National Scenic Trail became the first through the National Trail System Act, and also as part of that, a unit of the National Park System. So here's one of the early signs, noting that it goes from Oglethorpe to Katahdin, a total of 2,050 miles. That's Mount Katahdin in Maine. It's usually just referred to as Katahdin. And the current route of the AT is now 2,197.4 miles. Keeps getting a little longer, as Candace noted, with relocations of the trail. We relocate the trail to improve its scenic quality, since it's a national scenic trail, and to improve its sustainability, and on occasion to improve its safety. It goes through 14 states from Georgia to Maine, goes through 6 other national parks, the major ones being Great Smoky Mountains and Shenandoah National Parks, goes through 8 national forests. Interestingly, even though the AT is a unit of the National Park System, more of the land along the AT, almost 50%, is administered by the U.S. Forest Service as opposed to the National Park Service. Goes through 7 national heritage areas, 67 state-owned public lands, including a number of state parks, and 150 local townships. So our management direction is one thing that really sets the Appalachian Trail apart from other trails and other organizations and recreational things that the federal government administers. So we use what is called the cooperative management system. This is a really key thing for us. We refer to it as the 3-legged stool also, because the 3 main partners in management are the 30 AT clubs and their volunteers, the federal, state, and local agency partners, and the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. On the right, you can see a map there of the maintaining clubs. They vary considerably in size and sophistication. The trail, the club with the least section of the trail is the Randolph Mountain Club up in New Hampshire, which looks after about 2 to 2.5 miles of the AT. And then the one with the longest is the Maine Appalachian Trail Club that oversees 250 miles of the AT in the state of Maine. Most of the clubs that are down in Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, they average probably 70 or 80 miles apiece, but the one that Candace worked with most used to have about 130 miles of the AT. That was the Tennessee Eastman Hiking and Canoeing Club. Our guidance comes from a number of places. Of course, the National Trail System Act provides some guidance as how a national scenic trail should be managed, and the AT specifically. One of the most important things about the AT is that it's managed for foot travel only. There are a couple of short sections of the trail that are open to horse use, but generally it's only open to hiking. The AT Comprehensive Plan was a document that was written by the Appalachian National Scenic Trail Office and was signed off on in 1981 by the director of the National Park Service and the chief of the U.S. Forest Service, and that's our management Bible. But there are also other very important documents like National Forest plans that contain AT management area specific direction and National Park general management plans that contain information about how to manage the AT. And then ATC itself, the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, also has policy that is used by both our organization and the 30 AT clubs. The 30 AT clubs, interestingly, are not chapters of the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. They are all standalone organizations. So while we would like to think maybe that we could direct them, in fact, we sort of lead from behind and encourage them to do the right thing. One of the most important aspects of the comprehensive plan is that it directs us to keep AT volunteers in a leadership position. And unlike, and I'll not say this about the U.S. Forest Service, Candace, because they've always been great partners, but the National Park Service, in terms of working with volunteers, usually considers volunteers as an asset. And in fact, for the Appalachian National Scenic Trail, they are full partners in management of the Appalachian National Scenic Trail. And we occasionally have some issues with new Park Service employees who don't quite understand why that could possibly be the case. Sort of overturning your suggestion, Julie, does anybody have any questions about AT management or history? And I can't see you or hear you all very well, so maybe you can tell me if there are any questions.
There is one question about, do you have to have a permit to walk the Appalachian Trail?
There are 2 places on the AT that require permits, and that's only for overnight stays. One is Great Smoky Mountains. Well, that's not true. You now need a permit overnight in both Great Smoky Mountains National Park and Shenandoah National Park, and then the other place is Baxter State Park, which is is where Katahdin is located. Generally speaking, day hikers don't need any permits that I'm aware of, and I'm pretty sure there are none for day hikers. And that's one of the visitor use management issues I'll get to in a minute.
All right. We'll take other questions after.
Okay, so Helene damage. So there was a lot of Helene damage. It started just north of Great Smoky Mountains National Park and extended north into Virginia up to I-77 near Wytheville, if you know where that is. And it varied in intensity from place to place, but there were just significant spots and many, many miles of things that look like this. This is near Erwin, Tennessee, up on as you go up toward Big Bald, and just, acres and acres and acres of blowdown, total blowdown, kind of like you were talking about, Julia, for pine trees around you. Here's one we're looking at the Appalachian Trail near Iron Mountain Gap, on the North Carolina-Tennessee border near Roan Mountain, if you know where that is. And there was a stretch there of about 2 or 3 miles that just looked like this. and it was inconceivable, the damage that was done in some places. The AT has a series of overnight sites. There's a fairly continuous shelters, which are very primitive, generally three-sided lean-tos, but a lot of work goes into building them and maintaining them. This is two examples of ones that got squashed by trees falling on them during Helene. The one on the left is the Cherry Gap shelter, and the one on the right is the Moreland Gap shelter. Both were on, I think they were both on your district canvas. I can't remember for sure if Cherry Gap was, but Moreland Gap was. And so, yeah, it's pretty devastating. But as I say here, the AT is now open again, thanks to the tremendous work of both the AT volunteers and the staff, primarily of the Cherokee National Forest, that came out and helped. They just did a huge, nose to the grindstone job of just staying after it day after day and week after week to get it all reopened again. So now I'm going to talk about visitor use management some. I'm going to probably be referring to it as VUM. So that's what that means. We've been doing visitor use management from the very beginning. Anything you do to help a visitor is visitor use management. And so, we're old hands at basic visitor use management. This is why we're doing it now. And Candace mentioned a walk in the woods. I don't know, it's taken off. Hang on a second. It has started moving on its own.
I see. I'm not the only one that happens to. Your mouse just jumps in there, and all of a sudden you're 3 slides ahead.
Yeah, I can't stand it when it does that. There's some way to turn it off, but I don't know.
Oh.
Anyway, so when the book A Walk in the Woods came out, there was this graph is showing the number of through hikers that start in Georgia every year. They also start in other locations, but this is primarily Georgia. And so there was a significant increase in the number of through hikers after the book came out. And then, as you can see, use went down until about 2007, which coincided with when Robert Redford bought the movie rights, told us about that, and we all got kind of freaked out because of it. And then, of course, nobody knew about it, but coincidentally, visitor use numbers for through hikers at least began to rise at about 10% per year following that date anyway. 2 movies came out instead of just one. The movie Wild was about a Pacific Crest National Scenic Trail through hike attempt. That was actually more popular, I think, than the movie A Walk in the Woods, but both coincided. And as you can see, the visitation went up. There was a huge dip during COVID, but continued to rise after that. Visitor use management is important because it helps us balance the benefits and access against desired resource conditions and visitor opportunities. It's now a new planning system that was devised by the Interagency Visitor Use Council. We have embraced it at ATC. Sorry about this. I don't know why it just came all of a sudden.
Is your thing on automatic advance?
It is, but let me jump out real quick, see if I can.
It's like it's advancing for you.
It definitely is. I'm not sure exactly where that is, though. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'll just
okay.
Continue and keep going back.
We'll see if it stopped doing that.
So anyway, 6 federal agencies got together to come up with a better documented and consistent planning process than existed previously, because some of those previous planning efforts were getting taken to court and they were losing. And it's just very expensive to do these planning processes, and the losses were considered unacceptable. So this new process was invented to address the deficiencies that were identified by the courts. And we used it for the first time in 2015 on the AT for all of the AT in Georgia, and it proved so successful that we continued using it. So now we have 6 what I call formal visitor use management planning processes going on along the AT, all of Georgia, Max Patch, and the Roan Highlands, which are both along the Tennessee-North Carolina line. We've just begun about a year ago one for the Mount Rogers National Recreation Area in Southwest Virginia. One has been initially completed for the AT near Roanoke, Virginia, and the McAfee Knob area, and then one up in New Hampshire at Franconia, Notch, and Ridge. And again, Candace, almost all those are done on U.S. Forest Service land in cooperation with the U.S. Forest Service, who have been wonderful partners in this process. But the effort is to protect the Appalachian Trail hiking experience. It's intended to provide a reasonably primitive experience, or perhaps a better way of putting it is a natural experience. We have adapted the U.S. Forest Service's recreation opportunity spectrum for the AT. The spectrum has 6 zones that go from primitive to urban, and we are using that to zone the AT, if you will. We don't like to use the word zone. The Park Service doesn't like that, but we're using that anyway. So here's an example of how it works on the Tennessee Eastman Hiking Club section and along the North Carolina-Tennessee border. Their piece of the trail, the club's piece of the trail, is divided from their perspective into uniform pieces of experience. And they first rate the current condition, and then, if different, they also rate the desired condition. Generally speaking, we presume that the desired condition will be more primitive than the current condition, and then any visitor use management planning that occurs focuses on those areas where there's a gap between the current and the desired condition. This isn't going to help you too much if you're not familiar with their section, but this is a map of what it looks like. We use the geographic information systems to map the results of those, and this shows the desired condition for the Tennessee Eastman hiking and canoeing section, which doesn't have any urban sections, although there are several sections of the AT which actually go through towns like Hot Springs, North Carolina, and Damascus, Virginia, are 2 local ones. But this one does show 2 wilderness areas, and interestingly, the current condition shows that because of the amount of use that's in particularly the Pond Mountain wilderness, it doesn't quite stand up to what it should for a federally designated wilderness area. So we'll be working on that. The purpose of the AT experience analysis is to narrow the focus from trail-wide descriptions to local experience descriptions. When you say that the AT should have a primitive experience, that doesn't help the local people all that much. There's lots of the AT that is in fairly urban areas, like as you go through the Mid-Atlantic region, you're much closer to development than and elsewhere in the South. We are very blessed because the AT is deeply within either national forest or national parkland. But also it helps to simplify the visitor use management planning process by addressing the current and desired conditions, which are step 3 and 5 of the 14-step visitor use management planning process. And for the first time provides a shared vocabulary for all AT managers about the AT experience and a consistent way to make comparisons trail-wide instead of just locally for those experiences. And as I've mentioned, it provides a gap analysis, which we've never done before either. And importantly, at the end of our first century of the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, it provides a benchmark so we can determine going forward, is the AT getting better or is it getting worse? So another thing we do, and I'm presuming that you can see that up at the top, gets covered by stuff that's telling me, but we have a new program called the Sustainable Overnight Site program, and call it SOS for short. And that's designed to deal with our overnight sites in particular, but also those are a separate part of the AT experience analysis. Each designated overnight site also received a current versus desired AT experience analysis. So that's actually been done for all 30 AT clubs for the AT experience analysis. And now we're working on a comprehensive overnight site inventory up and down the trail. Last year, we did about 40% of the trail going from the Tennessee-Virginia line north to central Pennsylvania. We're also working on an overnight site facility assessment of all of the AT overnight sites that are designated along the trail. And then we're going to use all that information to give the data to local AT managers so they can decide if an overnight site does what it's supposed to do. If not, does it need to be repaired or replaced? Perhaps it's in a really lousy location, because a lot of the traditional locations of AT overnight sites are in flat places near water. That causes problems because there's often user-created site expansion and nothing to contain that. And it's also often an area that's pretty high probability for cultural resources. So sometimes they'll need to be relocated. And then because we have so many people using the AT, there are often user-created sites that no one has designated or approved. And so many of those are going to get removed through this process. Here's an example of what we found in one location. This is the bottom site there is actually Springer Mountain, and then 8 miles north is the Hawk Mountain Shelter. And on this 8-mile stretch of the AT, there were 138 overnight sites identified in the campsite inventory, of which only 20 were considered either compliant or compliant by exception. So that gives you an idea of the scope of the problem we have in areas that receive too many people in one place at one time. Part of our visitor use management is about improving data along the trail. That's been really important. We discovered in our first visitor use management planning process that, most of our data that we had was paper data and was very hard to deal with, or it wasn't the right data. So we've been working hard to identify what data is needed as a least common denominator everywhere up and down the trail. How best to collect it, we've decided on using a new app called the Recreation Impact Monitoring System app, and then deliver that data in real time to local AT managers, which is just in itself a shocking improvement, because even in past methods of collecting data digitally, it often took 3-4 years to get from our federal partners to our local AT managers. Oops, sorry. And then in terms of visitor use management goals overall, again, we want to provide timely data, continue to facilitate formal VUM planning, and there, in addition to the 6 already, I'm sure there will be several more at least in coming years. Provide the benchmark I discussed. And then, the SOS program is designed for us to lead a paradigm shift to excellent, sustainable overnight and group site systems. And that is such a good idea that it's being largely funded by a couple of private donors who are ex-AT thru hikers and realize what it's really like out there and have said, yes, we think this is a wonderful idea. Let's make it work.
That Lance had asked, are there dangerous areas where there might be wildlife like bears or dangerous cliffs or something where people would need to know that there's more caution to be had? You are in wilderness, though.
AT is intended to provide a primitive experience. I will say that probably the wildlife that gives AT campers the most trouble is mice. So there are bears. There's a huge density of bears in Great Smoky Mountains National Park and other places. We commonly have human-bear interactions in North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and New Jersey and New York. And we have not had any on the Appalachian Trail that were super serious, but in the Smokies, there have been 2 fatalities originating from bears near the AT, but had nothing to do specifically with the AT. Bears travel as much as 50 miles a day, so it's something to be aware of. But one of the most important things regarding bears and human interactions is to do a good job of storing food while camping. And traditionally, AT hikers have been pretty bad at that. And so we now have, actually it just expired on April 14th, but we had a U.S. Forest Service Region 8, which goes from, encompasses the AT from Georgia up through Shenandoah National Park, that was specific to the AT, that required people to store their food properly. And we now strongly recommend that people use bear canisters and store those away from where they're sleeping. And our hope is that eventually, if people will do the right thing, that the link that bears have between food and humans will die away and the problem will become less. I will say over the past few years that the human bear encounters have been going downhill, and the number of the amount of use of bear canisters is going up. So I hope that that's related, but we haven't proved that.
I gathered from what you were saying, there's specific overnight areas where they want people to stay in designated areas. And so in those designated areas, is there a restroom facility, or is it still all like primitive, bury what you produce and don't leave no trace behind?
Yeah, so many of the high use designated overnight sites do have generally now what we call moldering privy, which is a kind of a low maintenance composting privy. That's about as good as it gets, frankly. But the issue with visitor use management related to this is, so as the amount of visitation increases, do we just continue to increase the number of facilities along the trail? Is that sustainable? I don't think it is. This is not ATC policy, I'm about to quote you, but I think that what we need is to continue to try and help visitors learn responsible use of the AT. Instead of providing them with AT shelters, they should bring their own tent or hammock or whatever it is they like to sleep in. They should be prepared to cat hole, which is the leave no trace acceptable method of burying your own waste, and do that properly. Use bear canisters instead of relying on facility manager provided food storage devices, that kind of thing. That's my hope. I think it's a vain hope in some regards, but generally speaking, if I had my way, the AT would no longer have any shelters, would not have any privies, except in areas where the water table is really high. For instance, in New England, the AT gets above tree line in a long stretch, and there's a lot of glaciated areas north of New Jersey that where the soil is much thinner than our nice deep soil in the southern Appalachians. And so those areas, it's probably appropriate to have toilet facilities provided. But everywhere else along the trail, I would just as soon get rid of them. That's just one man's opinion.
Is there any discussion with the management of the AT of making it a permitted limited traffic, like a ticketed system or something like some of the national parks have done, where you have to have a permit to be staying overnight?
Does anybody know what the most heavily visited national park unit is? Top two. Give me the top two. Anybody?
Smokies.
Yosemite.
Yellowstone.
Smokies is number 2. What's number 1? Blue Ridge
Yellowstone?
Parkway. Blue Ridge Parkway.
Blue Ridge
Oh.
Parkway. Oh, because you're driving right. I mean, you can drive right through it.
So there is a permit system in the Smokies for overnight use, and as I mentioned, one in Shenandoah National Park too. At the moment, through hikers do not have to have an itinerary. They get a blanket permit for 5 days that allows them to stay wherever, any shelter that they come to. And that causes some huge buildups of the number of through hikers and spring break hikers at shelters there. Same thing in Georgia. Every time we start a visitor use management formal planning process, this subject comes up almost immediately. And so far the answer is no, but Great Smoky Mountains National Park is getting more and more serious about making through hikers abide by the same permit regulations as everybody. And if that happens, it's going to have a domino-like effect south, which could be a good thing. And we currently have an online AT registration system for campers called atcamp.org. That was modeled after the Smokies registration system and could be turned into a permit system if need be, either trail-wide or for specific parts of the trail. No discussion of that at the moment, but it may become necessary if the Smokies does that. It doesn't, there is a permit system required on the Pacific Crest National Scenic Trail. They have roughly the same number of people starting on that trail now as the AT does. And it helps some, but frankly, the problem is too many people in one place at one time. And even if you get, say, 50 people a day to start, they don't stay at 50 people a day as they go north because people hike at different rates, et cetera, et cetera. So they get clumped up, and it's the clumps of people that cause the problems. It'll be too many people for a designated overnight site or whatever. And so they don't do it intentionally, but as they're looking for a place to pitch their tent or whatever, they may be starting to trample, some of the vegetation, and slowly over time, the campsites enlarge because of that.
Right.
So it's being considered, but it's not likely. But to go back to my original question about what's the most visited national park or parks, we have started to experiment with using aggregated anonymous mobile phone data to figure out how many people are actually using the Appalachian Trail. We have no idea how many, or previously we had no idea how many day hikers that were using the AT because there was no way to keep track of them. We have now participated in a visitor use study with the National Park Service that focused on 3 different long distance entities that are difficult to measure use on. One was the National Historic Trail, the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail. The other one was, I can never think of the name of it, but a national river in Nebraska. Has a weird name like Oraba or something. And then the Appalachian National Scenic Trail. And that study came back with a number that just knocked us on our rear end. And the previous number we have been quoting for many years based upon a statistically valid study that was done about 20 or 30 years ago was 3 to 4 million AT hikers a year. If the mobile data is right, we're number one.
Yeah. And I will say that one of the things that we like to do for our speakers to thank you for your time is we donate a book to a little free library. And so this book was picked specifically for your topic today, 2,000 Miles to Happy. And it was in honor of 1948 World War II veteran Earl Schaffer, who decided to walk the war out of his system and became the first person to report hiking the Appalachian Trail in one continuous journey. And so we will put this in a little free library with your name in it.